Hey, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to announce the passing of a political slash conservative slash Christian media figure, one that has been with us throughout the half of the 20th century into the 21st century. A very controversial individual, a polemicist, if you will, but giving credit where credit is due in this regard to this individual, this man, Pat Robertson, passing away at the age of 93. Now, I say give credit where credit is due because many people with my political persuasion in particular do not care for this person's political views. Unlike an individual like the late Charles Stanley, who passed away this year as well, Pat Robertson, who was apolitical, didn't really get into politics, just kept it to the gospel and the Christian message. Pat Robertson was indeed political. In fact, he was so political that he actually ran unsuccessfully in a bid for president of the United States in 1988 for the Republican nomination against George H.W. Bush and came pretty close to actually getting the nomination. It was during this time that a year before that he formed the Christian Coalition and basically was the catalyst for what would become the modern Christian right. Robertson himself had political origins. His father was A. Willis Robinson, um, a politician from Virginia, a conservative Democratic politician out of Virginia that worked closely with Senator Robert Byrd. So that tells you all you need to know about some of his sketchy beliefs in regard to race. We all know what the Dixiecrats stood for, what their political stances were during those times with race. They were the faction of the Democratic Party that did not agree with they were the southern faction of the Democratic Party that did not agree with the northern faction that was trying to fight for civil rights for African Americans. Strom Thurmond was among this group. Strom Thurmond, in fact, the one who, during the 1948 Democratic National Convention, walked out of the 1948 Democratic National Convention and composed the Southern Manifesto, basically a manifesto and a credo devoted to maintaining segregation. George Wallace was also a part of this group, and Robert Byrd, who later reformed his ways and remained a Democrat, despite the political affiliation switching sides after 1965 when President Johnson put forth the 64-65 when he put forth the Voting Rights Act and the um, Civil Rights Act, respectively. Robert Byrd was one of those who remained with the Democrats. Most switched to the Republicans. Most of the Southern Democrats switched to the Republicans when the Democratic Party became fully committed to the ideology of liberalism. But Pat Robertson's father was not among these. Pat Robertson, be- among those that remained, Pat Robertson became a Republican. It was in 1956 when he met a Dutch preacher by the name of, let me try to get this name correct, Cornelius Vanderbergen, that he fully committed to uh, to evangelical Christianity after being drafted to the army in 1948, and serving his call of duty in the Korean War. Later, during his presidential campaign, his service will come into question. Some people questioned whether or not he actually served in the military. His political opposition would question it, but he provided the receipts and everything. And like I said, in 1956, after coming out of the army, he devoted himself to Christianity, and it was during this time, a little while later, in 1960, that he founded the Christian Broadcasting Network, which would become by purchasing a UHF station. Now, many people don't know what UHF stations were. They were independent satellite stations that broadcast to local affiliates. They were not part of the three main stations of TV. They were the second dial on traditional television sets, and this is what he purchased to start this. And he basically started the wave in the 1980s of televangelists. Yes, we had Christian polemicists before in the radio era, like Father Coughlin, for example, or Oral Roberts was another example. You know, but never to the extent that it reached so many people in such a short time. And it was shortly after this that cable came into existence. So much like professional wrestling, televangelism benefited from cable, the cable overlay, the national overlay, and CBN was no exception. He took it further by founding his own law firm and then founding his own university. Basically, he and Jerry Falwell sought to recreate American society because after the 1960s, they had kind of saw that American society was being pulled in a much more liberal direction. So they galvanized to push back and create the counter to the counterculture. As the counterculture was pushing the culture to a left wing position, they were pushing it back to a more conservative family based tradition, creating their own networks, creating their own schools, creating their own law firms, their own political think tanks, everything. Everything that was involved the Bible. And one of the events, besides the idea of busing, which was a debate in the 1970s, basically the idea that Christian schools would be subject to the same sort of desegregationist laws that the 1954 Brown versus Board of Ed case would. Christian schools objected to this because they considered themselves parochial. They considered themselves not part of the public school system. They felt the white Christian schools felt that they didn't have to be subject to this sort of desegregationist policies. So that was one of the first issues that galvanized the political religious right in this country. The other issue was, of course, the real cornerstone issue that even caused the Protestant charismatics and Southern Baptists such as Pat Robertson to unite with the Catholics was the abortion issue. The abortion issue was a more marketable and a more favorable issue to a more favorable cross to take up at that time in 1973, the overtone of Roe v. Wade, than um, the segregationist issue, because the desegregationist issue with the schools in the minds of most Americans, that was not the hill to die on, because most Americans, besides the hardcore segregationists at that time, believed that that was a dead issue and that segregation was evil and segregation was immoral and school segregation, Christian or otherwise, was not right. So of course they weren't going to choose that as their moral crusade. They took up another moral crusade that was more agreeable, and they were influenced by the Catholics. The Catholics, before the Protestants, the Catholics were the first to oppose abortion. But after Roe v. Wade and abortion becomes legal throughout um, all of the 50 states, the Protestants began to get on it, and this becomes the issue that galvanizes the modern evangelical movement. It's kind of analogous to how the abolitionist movement galvanized the evangelical movement in the 19th century with the Second Great Awakening. That this one issue becomes the issue that drives the entire movement. So that's kind of what the anti-abortion issue became. And of course, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell was behind this. Of course, another issue that galvanized the political right in this country was the gay rights movement. We talked about in this channel before. 1969, the Stonewall riots in New York City becomes the issue that pushes the LGBTQ movement forward, and with each decade, with some setbacks, of course, the AIDS epidemic setback, um, the LGBT movement moves forward and forward and gets more political gains throughout the decade. But of course, this angers um, those on the political right, and this becomes another wedge issue, another culture war issue, in which they use to gain more political power and more political influence throughout the culture. Because as the left wing pushes forth with the counterculture, they push forth with the counterculture. And one of them counterculture warriors was Robinson himself, the most vocal, I would say, next to Jerry Falwell. And because of this, he, over the years, has said some wild stuff. One of the things he said after 9/11, he was interviewing Jerry Falwell at this time. And after 9/11, he says, Falwell says that uh, another pastor, that 9/11 happened to the United States because of the pagans, the gays, the abortionists, and the feminists, and the ACLU, and every other liberal organization in existence. And Robertson doesn't argue this point. He nods. In effect, he agrees with everything that Jerry Falwell is saying, and he himself comes out on later episodes and says similar things with regards to Hurricane Katrina and the 2010 Haiti earthquake, because he makes reference to the idea, the historical myth. Well, there's some historical reality. It's grounded in some historical reality with regards to Haiti, that Haiti achieved the independence that they achieved in 1804, becoming the first black republic in the world to ever achieve independence, the only group of slaves in the Western Hemisphere to achieve independence. And they achieved this independence not by their own will, not by their own fortitude, but by a pact with the devil. Now, it is true to some degree that Haitian culture is very influenced by Voodoo, which is the traditional West African religion from the country of Benin. We talked about this in other videos, um, particularly the Woman King video, where um, that particular movie is set in the medieval kingdom of Dahomey, where Voodoo originates. It is true that the vast majority of Africans shipped to the Caribbean island of Haiti did come from that area, and Voodoo, that traditional African religion of Voodoo, which we know as voodoo, um, in the United States was allowed to grow. And it is true that many of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution were influenced by voodoo priests. Now, whether or not something that the voodoo priest did in 1804 is justification for them to lose their lives in such a natural disaster in 2010, hundreds and hundreds of years later, is very debatable. And he also points to the fact that there were previous slave rebellions by led by voodoo priests, particularly one in 1791 by an individual named Macandel, a Haitian pre-revolutionary hero, kind of like a Patrick Henry of Haiti or Samuel Adams of Haiti, of sorts. So he was trying to say that the influence of voodoo in Haitian culture and the fact that a lot of the Haitian revolutionaries, especially those that were directly from Africa, were involved with voodoo, that this is the reason why Haiti is so poor, and this was the reason why Haiti suffered the earthquake that they suffered in 2010. He just trying to link things that are unlinkable, trying to say that people's actions are the cause of certain disasters. It's things that either they've done or that their ancestors have done, saying that the victims, victim blaming basically. And he did the exact same thing in with regards to Hurricane Katrina, trying to say that the debauchery. Hey Lisa, what's going on? The debauchery of uh, that's involved in Mardi Gras is the reason why um, Hurricane Katrina happened and the entire city of New Orleans in 2005 was completely wiped out. Tried to do the exact same thing with regards to the tsunami in 2006 in Asia. And when he says things like this, these things like this are completely disgusting because these people's cultural practices and the things that are part of their culture that don't line up necessarily with conservative Christianity or their sexualities or their political beliefs like feminism or liberalism are not the like feminism and liberalism and homosexuality is not the reason why 9/11 happened to the United States. Um, Being associated with voodoo hundreds and hundreds of years ago during the Haitian Revolution is not why the 2010 Haitian earthquake happened. The fact that Mardi Gras takes place in New Orleans is not the reason why Hurricane Katrina happened. The fact that Buddhism and Hinduism are the prevalent religions in Asia where the tsunami took place is not the reason why the tsunami happened. You know, I guess he forgot to read his Bible, the part in the Bible where it says, the sun shines on the just and the unjust. In other words, natural disasters and horrible things are going to happen to individuals and individual cultures, whether or not they line up with the Judeo Christian worldview or not. You know what I'm saying? So just because they're not overly religious and just because they don't line up with his particular interpretation of a Judeo Christian worldview, they deserve death and natural disasters and pestilence upon them. No, that's bullshit. You know, another thing that he said, another group that he targeted besides gay people and people, Haitians and uh, the mostly black city of New Orleans and Asians was Muslims. Of course, after 9/11, there was a storm of anti Islamic propaganda being put out by evangelical Christians trying to paint uh, people of the Muslim faith as evil and as terrorists. And Pat Robertson himself even said that Prophet Muhammad was a terrorist and spared no expense at every cost to denounce. Right, exactly. Lisa says he probably would have had something to say about the Canadian wildfires. Yep, he would have. Probably because Canada is much more liberal leaning and much more left wing leaning than the United States. He probably would have said that's the reason why uh, um, Canada, suffered these wildfires because God is bringing His wrath upon them. But when it came to Muslims, he any chance he got to denounce Muslims, to say evil things about Muslims, he did. Now he also was fond of making political predictions, predicting who was going to win the presidency every election cycle. And no surprise, he would always pick the Republican. Uh, right, at least since it came to NYC, a liberal state. He always picked the conservative Republican candidate, even suggesting that Donald Trump would win the 2020 election. Thank God he was wrong on that, making making prophecies about who would win each election. Sometimes he was right, sometimes he was just winging it. He said that 2020 was the beginning of the end for the world. And he would say that, um, of course, just like every evangelical Christian leader, was a hardcore, hard wing supporter of Israel, and did not grant any uh, headway to the Palestinians, considered the Palestinian claim uh, illegitimate, and believed that Ariel Sharon suffered his stroke. Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, who pulled out of Gaza in 2006, the Gaza territory in 2006. Ariel Sharon suffered his stroke because God was judging him because of his pullout and his commitment to, uh, Palestinian autonomy. So basically, this man, Pat Robertson, although he was very much an accomplished preacher, he wasn't really even a preacher because yes, he preached the Bible, right? And he was influentially at that show, the 700 Club. But if you watch that show, it like I said, it wasn't like with Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley would preach the Bible, preach the Word of God, preach out of the Word of God, and didn't really say anything political necessarily. Billy Graham also will preach the Word of God, preach the Scriptures, preach redemption, preach forgiveness, preach Christ crucified, basically Christian theology. But he also would stay out of political thought. He didn't engage with political thought. But this guy, Pat Robertson, he was one of those preachers that believed that in order for Christianity to take root again in the United States and become a force, a cultural force like it was, back in the day, that they had to engage in politics. And they didn't only engage in politics and they didn't only express their political opinions. They expressed their political opinions oftentimes through, like the examples I gave, hate, calling Islam an evil religion, calling Hinduism an evil religion, saying that he would never support a Hindu candidate for president or a Muslim candidate for president. One of the ones lending credence to when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, to the idea that Barack Obama was a sacred Muslim, uh, lending credence to the idea that Islam was trying to dominate the world, trying to take over the world. Oftentimes, he would have these anti-Islamic writers on his panel on his show. Walid Shubat, for example, was one of them. Fake people claiming to be former members of Hamas, former members of Al Qaeda, you know, trying to discredit the Muslim religion or trying to discredit the LGBT community or trying to discredit, not necessarily, didn't really come out against the African American community as like directly, because let's face it, the African American community is very religious. And surprisingly, when he was running in 1988, he got a lot of support, more than any other conservative candidate from the African American religious community. So he didn't really say anything really overtly racist. He wasn't like one of those types, like a Rush Limbaugh. But so the things that he would say were kind of mean spirited, especially towards other religions and gay people uh, and women. You know what I mean? Being against uh, abortion, women's right to choose. So he didn't say anything really racist, but homophobic, Islamophobic, racist against like Indian people, Indian religion, yeah, Asians, things like that. But um, surprisingly, like I said, from a guy who came from a segregationist background, his father was a segregationist. He himself was not that. He himself did it. He actually campaigned in Bedford Stuyvesant when he was running. Like I said, when he was running for president, he wrote a book. He wrote a book in 1991 called "The New World Order." Again, lending credence to a conspiracy theory that the oligarchs or the elites of the world coded Jewish people. Even though he was pro-Israel, there's always this pro-Israel stance that some of these conservatives take. It is actually pro-Israel and anti-Semitic at the same time. While it's pro-Israel, it appeals to old anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish people controlling the banks or Jewish people controlling, government institutions like Hollywood. It's like protocols of the elders of Zion type shit, but repackaged at the same time to be pro-Israel. So he he lent credence to this conspiracy theory too, terming it the New World Order. Right after September 11th, 1991, when George H.W. Bush made this speech, this New World Order speech. It was like right after that he published this book, and he was like and it automatically became like the religious Alex Jones before Alex Jones. You know what I mean? So my grandma used to watch him a lot, and I always found him to be a sketchy individual because, to me, I believe as a religious man, the the things that Christ taught were not political in nature. And when you try to mix the two, and you try to mix religion and politics, mix church and state, you get into trouble there. And that's not the essence. That's not the essence, really, of what Christianity is all about. Repeatedly throughout Christ's life, he comes to the earth and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. Give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and give to God's what is God's," indicating right there the difference between the new covenant of Christ and the old covenant of the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel in the Old Testament was a political nation, a political entity with a legal law, the Jewish halakha, the Jewish law. Christianity is not that. Christianity, which is the new covenant, is a bond, a spiritual governance, not a political governance. And when you try to do things like the Pat Robertsons of the world do and use religion to influence political thought, you run into trouble because when your political ideas don't line up with the spirit of Christ, which is the spirit of love and the spirit of tolerance, I believe the spirit of is the true spirit of Christ and the spirit of acceptance, then it ends up looking bad for Christianity. It ends up looking like Christianity is a hateful religion, and Christianity is a hateful ideology, and Christianity is only against things and not for things. You know what I mean? So, as helpful as he tried to be with some of his charities around the world in places like Africa and in the Rwandan genocide, some of the things that he said and some of the things that that charity did, such as smuggling blood diamonds, reflected badly back on on the Christian message that he was trying to convey. So rather than try to convey the message in love and forgiveness and mercy and tolerance, he ended up making Christianity look like it was just bigoted. And we all know this. We read the Bible, but that's not the Christian message. The Christian message is not a message of hate and a message of bigotry, but instead a message of love, tolerance, acceptance, and forgiveness and sacrifice. So, anyway, rest in peace to him. Only God can be the judge of his soul, but based on his rhetoric and the hate that he spewed throughout his life, I hope that towards the end of his life he repented for such vitriolic remarks. To me, that stuff that he said was unbiblical. You know, the best thing to do is preach the message as is, straightforward. Preach love, tolerance, acceptance. Not to preach that Christianity teaches things that it doesn't teach. I'm not saying that, but against God's will or against God's plan or God's design. What I am saying is you can do it with sugar and you don't have to do it with vinegar. You know what I'm saying, guys? And he took the vinegar approach because he tried to insinuate himself and his organization into politics and greed and money, and that's where he fell short. Uh, you know, and that's where the Christian right, I believe, falls short. Like, and you could say the same thing about the Muslim faith, but see, unlike the Muslim faith does have a dimension of politics to it. So you could kind of understand Islam being more tied in with the political cultures of their societies than Christianity. Christianity doesn't have a political apparatus. Jesus was not a politician. Jesus was not a statesman. Jesus did not set up a kingdom in the world. In fact, when his followers, like I said, when his followers wanted him to stage a political rebellion against the Romans, in the political occupation of Judea by the Romans during his time, he did not do that. He said to Peter, "You live by the sword and you will die by the sword." So that's it. And Lisa says, "Amen." And I say, "Thank you, Lisa, for your contributions." Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Love you guys.